On the wide open plains of Wyoming, there's a Mustang no cowboy can touch, until one summer morning, a boy no older than 8 pedals up a dusty road and walks straight into the corral. What happens next will uncover family secrets buried for decades and change more than one life forever. Where are you watching from right now? Drop a comment below and let us know. Wishing you a blessed and beautiful day. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next heartwarming story we share with you. The afternoon sun hung low over the rolling plains of western Kansas, its golden light spilling across fields of late summer grass that swayed in a dry breeze. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, carried by the faint smell of hay and horses. The Monroe Ranch sat just outside the small town of Harrow's Ford, a place where time moved at the pace of a man walking to Sunday service, and where news still traveled faster by mouth than by phone. The heat had baked the ground until it cracked in places, and the cicadas hummed their slow, droning chorus. Caleb Monroe stood on the porch of the ranch house, a tall man in his early 60s, his lean frame still strong despite the years of hard labor carved into his bones. His face was long and weathered, tanned deep by decades under the sun, with sharp cheekbones and lines etched by both laughter and loss. His eyes, steel gray and steady, carried the weight of someone who had seen his share of storms, both on the land and in life. A faded scar traced the line of his jaw, a remnant of a ranch accident in his youth, a reminder that every day with horses carried risk. Caleb's plaid shirt was rolled to the elbows, revealing sinewy forearms, and his worn denim jeans were tucked into scuffed brown boots. He was a man of few words, known in town as dependable, but with a quiet reserve that kept most from getting too close. Only those who knew him well understood the shadow that losing his younger brother in a rodeo accident had cast over his heart. Out in the far pen, the chestnut Mustang shifted restlessly, muscles rippling under his reddish-brown coat. He was a magnificent animal, tall, broad-chested, and strong, yet every movement was edged with tension, as if he carried a storm inside. His mane and tail were dark, almost black, tangled from wind and dust, and a thin white blaze ran down the length of his face to his soft muzzle. His eyes were a rich amber, sharp and watchful, and a faint old scar cut across his left flank. He was called Silverhawk, a name he'd carried since Caleb had first laid eyes on him during a roundup months ago. Nobody knew exactly how old he was, though Caleb guessed around 10. What they did know was that no one, not the ranch hands, not the neighboring trainers, had been able to get close without tasting his fury. Yet there was something in his stillness now that made Caleb pause. Beside Caleb stood Martha Monroe, his wife of nearly 40 years. At 59, she was a sturdy woman of average height, her frame softened by years of hearty meals and the quiet but endless work of keeping a ranch household running. Her face was warm, round-cheeked, with brown eyes that missed nothing. Her hair, once a rich chestnut, was streaked with silver and pulled back into a practical bun under the shade of a wide straw hat. Martha carried herself with the calm assurance of someone who had weathered her own share of storms, the kind who understood when to speak and when to simply stand alongside the man she'd built a life with. "He's worn himself half to death, Caleb," she said quietly, her voice carrying both concern and a tinge of sadness. Caleb nodded, his jaw tightening. "I'll call Dr. Weller tomorrow," he replied, meaning the veterinarian who sometimes took the jobs no one else wanted. "There's no point risking anyone else. He won't let himself be tamed." Martha placed a gentle hand on his arm. "You've always found a way before," she said softly, but her husband only shook his head. The dirt yard in front of the house lay still, except for the slow movements of Hank Doyle, a wiry man in his late 50s with a sun-battered face and a faded red bandana around his neck. Hank was one of the oldest ranch hands, as much a fixture on the Monroe place as the weathered fence posts. His boots and battered hat seemed welded to him, part of the man as much as his dry humor and sharp eye. Leaning against the fence, he studied the Mustang with narrowed eyes. "Mean as a cornered bobcat," Hank muttered to no one in particular. From down the road came the creak and rattle of an old bicycle. The rider was a boy, small for the battered bike beneath him, his knees sticking out as he pedaled. He wore a blue plaid shirt faded nearly to gray, its elbows patched with mismatched cloth, and jeans with frayed cuffs tucked into scuffed brown boots. A tan cowboy hat, clearly too large for him, sat low over a mop of straw-blonde hair. When he reached the yard, he swung one leg over the frame and hopped down, steadying himself with one hand on the seat. "Sir," the boy said, his voice clear but cautious. I came for the Mustang. Caleb stared, certain he'd misheard. You came for what? The Mustang, the boy repeated. The chestnut one in the far pen. The men exchanged looks. Men. Hank barked a laugh. Kid, you're out of your mind. Caleb stepped down from the porch, his boots crunching the gravel. What's your name, son? Eli. Eli Granger. Well, Eli, Caleb said. That horse is dangerous. Grown men have tried to work with him and failed. He's not for riding. He's not mean, Eli interrupted gently. Just waiting. Something in the boy's tone, calm, almost certain made Caleb pause. He watched as Eli walked toward the corral, his boots kicking up dust. The boy stopped just inside the gate, meeting Silverhawk's gaze. The Mustang's ears pricked forward, the muscles along his neck taut, but he didn't charge. Hey there, Eli murmured, stepping slow, the way a person might approach a skittish dog. It's just me. I came to see you. His voice carried in the dry air, steady, low, without the sharp edges that usually put the Mustang on guard. Caleb, Martha, and the hands stood in silence, watching something they couldn't explain. Silverhawk's nostrils flared as he tested the boy's scent. Then, in a movement that made Hank's hand twitch toward the gate latch, the Mustang took 2 steps forward. The space between them closed until Eli could reach out. Slowly, the boy's small fingers touched the side of the Mustang's muzzle. Up on the porch, Martha realized she'd been holding her breath. From the road came the sound of tires on gravel again, faster this time. An older woman appeared, pedaling hard on a rust-red bicycle, her gray hair streaming loose in the wind. She braked so sharply she nearly toppled, then leapt off and ran toward the corral. Eli, get away from there, she shouted. Eli turned, his hand still resting on the Mustang. It's okay, Grandma June. June Granger was about 65, with a sturdy build and the determined face of someone who had learned to survive on her own. Her eyes, dark brown and sharp, darted from the boy to Caleb. There was a flicker of recognition there, quick, then gone. Come on, Eli, she said firmly, though her voice trembled. We're leaving. Reluctantly, the boy stepped back. The Mustang watched him go, muscles tight but no longer aggressive, and took 1 step as if to follow. Caleb called out, Ma'am, the boy's got something special with that horse. June avoided his gaze. He's always had a way with animals, she said shortly, but we can't stay. Thank you for not letting him get hurt. With that, she guided Eli to the bicycle, mounted her own, and they pedaled away down the road, leaving the ranch yard silent, but for the restless pacing of the chestnut Mustang. The Wyoming dawn was slow to warm, the kind that left frost clinging to the ranch fences long after the sun had cleared the low hills. Caleb Monroe, a tall, lean man in his late 40s with shoulders bent more from years of hard work than age, walked out to the far pen with his hands deep in the pockets of his worn denim jacket. His face, tanned and lined, carried the look of someone who had learned to keep his thoughts to himself, a habit born from a betrayal years ago that had cost him both a partner and a herd. His boots crunched on the stiff earth as he approached the corral where Silverhawk waited. The chestnut Mustang stood still this morning, head slightly lowered, reddish-brown coat glinting in the early light. His dark mane stirred in the wind, the thin white blaze down his face bright against the winter-bleached sky. At around 10 years old, the stallion's frame was powerful yet unspent, and his amber eyes followed every movement Caleb made. Inside the pen, Eli stood by the fence, bundled in a navy sweater that was too big for his narrow shoulders. The boy, maybe 11, had a way of holding himself that seemed both watchful and sure, as though the world had shown him enough storms to know when to stand still. Caleb had noticed it yesterday, but now it was impossible to ignore. Silverhawk didn't pace or snort when Eli was near. Instead, he stepped toward the boy like they'd been sharing the same quiet for years. Martha, who had been watching from the porch with a mug in her hands, caught Caleb's eye. She was in her mid-50s, solidly built, with graying brown hair tied back, and a way of speaking that made people listen. Caleb saw the same unspoken question in her look that had been running through his mind since yesterday. How did this boy tame the untamable? The sound of tires on gravel broke the moment. A rust-red bicycle came into view, its rider pedaling hard up the drive. June Granger was a woman in her late 60s, tall for her age and wiry, with wind-burned cheeks and long gray hair streaming loose behind her. She wore a faded green wool coat patched at the elbows and jeans tucked into scuffed boots. Her blue eyes were sharp, but just now they held something close to panic. She braked so hard the bike wobbled, dropped it in the dirt, and strode toward the pen. "Eli! Away from the fence!" she called, her voice more command than plea. Eli didn't move his hand from Silverhawk's muzzle. "It's okay, Grandma June. He's fine." The Mustang's ears flicked at her voice, but he stayed put, breathing slow against the boy's palm. Caleb saw June stop short, a flicker of recognition or maybe fear passing over her face as her eyes landed on the stallion. That look stayed with him long after she took Eli home. That night, after the barn was closed and the lamps in the house burned low, Caleb found Martha at the kitchen table sorting through feed bills. "Does the name Granger mean anything to you?" he asked. Martha shook her head. "Should it?" Caleb told her about June's reaction. "Like she knew him," he said, "or at least what he is." The next morning, with chores done, Caleb drove the battered Ford into Laramie. The diner on the corner still smelled of coffee and bacon, and the old-timers held their usual posts along the counter. Among them was Howard Hutchins, a retired rancher with a memory as sharp as barbed wire. Caleb bought him coffee and mentioned June Granger. Hutch frowned. "Granger? No. But June Barrett. Now there's a name I recall." He leaned closer. "Widow. Lived out on Cottonwood Road with her daughter, quiet folks. Her girl passed young, some sickness years back. Don't know much about the boy's daddy. No one ever said." Caleb didn't press, but the pieces turned in his mind all the way back to the ranch. By afternoon, Eli was back, with June's reluctant permission. The boy came walking down the drive, carrying an apple in one hand and something like a promise in the way he moved. Silverhawk was already at the fence, ears forward, waiting. Gideon Pike, one of the hands, leaned on the top rail and muttered, "That's no training. That's a bond." Gideon was in his 30s, wide-shouldered and quiet, with a hat that shaded eyes always scanning for trouble. He'd worked enough stringy, mean-tempered horses to know when one had chosen its person. Across the yard, Ivy Halstead arrived in her old green pickup. She was in her early 40s, short, with a quick smile and hands chapped from years of running the feed store in town. But today her smile didn't reach her eyes. Over coffee in the tack room, she told Martha she might lose the store to a chain moving in from Cheyenne unless she found a business partner. Martha listened, fingers drumming on the table, already weighing numbers in her head. Caleb walked in halfway through and caught the tail end. He knew Martha's mind was working toward investing, and he also knew how quick a gamble like that could sour. Out in the pen, Eli stood with his hands resting on the top rail, speaking softly to Silverhawk. The stallion stepped close, breath clouding in the cool air, and nuzzled at the boy's sleeve. It was the kind of moment Caleb would have sworn was impossible until he saw it twice. As dusk settled, the ranch lights blinked on, casting the corral in gold. Caleb lingered by the fence, listening to the even rhythm of the Mustang's breathing beside the boy. Something in that sound eased a part of him he hadn't known was wound tight. The day had left more questions than answers, but for the first time in months, Caleb didn't feel the weight of them pressing as hard. The wind off the prairie carried the scent of sage and cold dust as Caleb Monroe steered his old Ford down the gravel road toward June Granger's house. The afternoon light was slanting gold, but his mood was leaden. He had tried to shake the unease since that day in the corral, but every time he pictured the boy's calm hand on Silverhawk's muzzle, something inside him tightened. June's home sat on the edge of town, a modest, weather-worn place with a sagging porch and peeling white paint. The garden out front had gone to seed, except for a single stubborn rose bush, its blooms long since gone but its stems still clinging to life. Caleb parked, took off his hat, and ran a hand through his graying hair. His boots creaked on the porch steps. June answered the knock after a pause. She was in her late 60s, maybe 70, her frame still straight despite her age. Her gray hair was pulled into a loose braid, and her eyes, pale blue and sharp, carried both weariness and steel. She wore a faded flannel shirt over a cotton dress as if caught between chores. "Caleb," she said, her tone wary. "Didn't expect you." "Figured you didn't," he replied, voice low. "Mind if we talk?" Her hesitation stretched into the chill air before she stepped aside. Inside, the house smelled faintly of tea and old wood. A photograph of a young woman with laughing eyes and wind-blown hair sat on the mantel, framed in simple oak. Caleb's gaze lingered there. "She was your daughter," he said, nodding toward the picture. June's mouth pressed into a thin line. "Anna. She had your stubborn streak. And your temper." Caleb's eyes flickered. "She worked at Willow Creek. Summer of, what was it, 15 years ago?" June nodded, but said nothing. Caleb turned toward her fully now, the weight of his question heavy in his chest. "And Eli?" Something shifted in her expression, like a door creaking open. For a long moment she looked at the floor. When she met his eyes again, her voice was quiet but unwavering. "Eli's father never knew he had a son," she said. "And that father is your boy." The words landed like a hammer blow. Caleb stood still, but inside, memories began to tumble. Ryan at 20, eager and restless, full of dreams bigger than the ranch. The last summer before veterinary school in Denver, the way he'd spoken of a girl named Anna. Caleb had thought it was a passing fling. "My son," Caleb repeated, as if testing the shape of the truth. "Ryan never knew?" "No," June said, shaking her head. "Anna found out she was expecting after he'd gone. She thought telling him would only tie him down, or worse, bring shame on your family. She made her choice." Caleb stared past her to the window, watching a lone cloud drift over the prairie. "And Silverhawk?" June's gaze softened. "She found him in the hills, just a colt. She said he was wild, but there was something in him worth keeping, raised him herself. That horse was her shadow, Caleb. When she laughed, he'd nudge her. When she cried, he'd stand guard." His throat tightened. "And when she died?" "Sudden illness. Caught us off guard. I couldn't keep a Mustang in the city. I sold him to a trader. Thought it was the kindest choice. Never imagined he'd find his way back here." Caleb's hands curled at his sides. "You should have told me." June's voice caught. "Maybe, but back then, I was just trying to protect what little we had left." They stood in silence until Caleb took a deep breath. "Eli has a right to know." "That's for me to decide," June said sharply, but her eyes betrayed doubt. Caleb gave a slow nod. "For now. But truth has a way of digging itself out." He left her porch with the weight of the revelation pressing against his ribs. Back at Willow Creek, the day had warmed enough for dust to lift from the paddocks. Eli was at the corral again, June's reluctant permission in his pocket like a fragile promise. The boy, small, lean, sun in his hair, stood with his arms folded on the fence rail, speaking softly to Silverhawk. The Mustang, once a tempest in muscle and bone, now lingered near him, ears forward, nostrils twitching. He nuzzled the boy's sleeve as if memorizing his scent. "That's no training," Gideon Pike muttered from where he leaned on the post, a toothpick between his teeth. "That's a bond." Caleb heard him, but didn't answer. He was watching Eli too closely, seeing the shape of Ryan in the boy's jawline, the way he carried himself. That evening, Martha returned from the feed store in town, her hair windblown and her expression thoughtful. She found Caleb by the barn, checking the hinges on the tack room door. "I saw Ivy," she said, pulling off her gloves. Caleb glanced up. "And?" "She's in trouble. Some big chain store's moving in and she can't match their prices. Says she might have to sell unless she finds a partner." Caleb frowned. "That's risky business." Martha crossed her arms. "Maybe, but sometimes running from a fight is riskier." It was the kind of line that lingered with him, not least because it reminded him of June's story of Anna, who had faced her own storms head-on. Night settled over Willow Creek with the sharp clarity only prairie skies could hold. Stars spilled across the black, and somewhere in the corral, Silverhawk shifted in the moonlight, his reddish-brown coat gleaming faintly. Caleb stood at the fence for a long time, watching Eli's shadow slip back toward June's old truck. The boy paused, turned, and lifted a hand in a small wave before disappearing down the road. Caleb's chest ached, not with doubt, but with the certainty that the truth, now unearthed, would change everything. The morning air over Willow Creek Ranch carried the bite of late autumn. Frost clung stubbornly to the tips of the corral rails, and the sky held the pale wash of a day not yet decided between sunshine and cloud. Caleb Monroe stood by his truck, hat in hand, his breath hanging white in the air. Martha stepped out from the porch, pulling her shawl tighter, her eyes set in that calm, unshakable way that meant she'd already made up her mind. They said little as they climbed into the cab. The old Chevy rattled down the gravel road, tires kicking loose stones into the ditches. Pastures slid by in streaks of gold and brown, the last of the grass bending under the weight of frost. Somewhere behind them, Silverhawk's silhouette stood at the fence, head high, ears forward, watching them leave. Denver was a world away from the stillness of Willow Creek. The skyline rose like a steel and glass canyon, its edges softened by a thin haze. Traffic moved in patient streams along tree-lined boulevards, the leaves turning the same burnt orange shade as the Mustang's coat back home. Caleb kept his hands on the wheel, shoulders stiff beneath his worn flannel shirt, as Martha read an address scrawled on a slip of paper. They found Ryan's veterinary clinic tucked between a cafe and a bicycle repair shop, the brickwork old but well kept. Inside, the air carried the clean scent of antiseptic and hay. A receptionist with kind eyes led them to a small office at the back. Ryan Monroe looked up from a stack of charts. He was 32 now, tall, broad-shouldered like his father, with the same gray-blue eyes that could turn stormy without warning. His dark hair was cropped short, but a few rebellious strands fell over his forehead. He wore a buttoned lab coat over a checkered shirt, the sleeves rolled just enough to show forearms corded with muscle from years of work with restless animals. "Dad?" His voice was uncertain, a question and a warning in the same breath. Caleb swallowed hard. "Ryan, we need to talk." Martha closed the door gently behind them. She stayed near the wall, letting the weight of the moment settle where it needed to. Caleb fumbled inside his jacket and brought out an envelope, its edges worn, the ink faded but still clear. This was from Anna Barrett. You remember her? Ryan froze mid-breath. Anna? From the ranch. That summer? Caleb nodded. She's gone, Ryan. Been gone for years now. But before she died, she left this. Ryan slid the letter from its envelope. The paper trembled in his hands as his eyes moved over the small, sharp handwriting. Anna's words unfolded like a voice from another life. The brief joy they'd shared, the decision to leave, the birth of a boy named Eli. Her plea was simple but fierce. Give him the chance to know his father. By the time Ryan reached the end, his jaw was tight and his knuckles white around the page. I have a son? Yes, Caleb said, voice low. And he's here, at Willow Creek. The Mustang you've heard about, Silverhawk, he's tied to Eli's story. Anna raised them both. When she passed, her mother, June, took the boy in, sold the horse, couldn't keep him in the city. Fate, or something like it, brought Silverhawk back to us. Ryan looked at him, disbelief and something raw flickering in his eyes. Why didn't anyone tell me? Anna was scared, thought I'd see it as a scandal. Maybe I would have back then. But I'm telling you now. Caleb's voice caught on the last word. For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of the clinic's refrigerator. Then Ryan folded the letter carefully and slid it back into the envelope. I need to meet him. Back at Willow Creek, the sky had shifted toward evening. Long shadows reached over the pastures and the wind carried the scent of dry grass and cold earth. June Granger stood on her porch when Caleb's truck pulled in. Her pale blue eyes narrowed and she gripped the railing as they approached. Caleb wasted no time. June, Ryan wants to meet Eli. Her lips pressed into a thin line. I won't have the boy's life turned upside down. He's been through enough. I'm not asking for claims, not yet, Caleb said. Just a meeting. Let them see each other. No more lies between them. She studied him for a long beat, the wind lifting stray strands of gray hair around her face. Then slowly she nodded. One meeting. That's all I promise. The next afternoon, the air was crisp and bright. Silverhawk stood near the fence, the sun catching on the sheen of his chestnut coat, breath puffing in soft clouds. Eli was already there, leaning on the rail, speaking to the Mustang in that quiet way of his. Ryan approached with Caleb beside him, boots crunching on the frost. Eli glanced over his shoulder, eyes curious but guarded. Eli, Caleb said gently, this is Ryan. He's a friend of mine. Ryan stepped closer, his hands loose at his sides. "Hey," he said softly, "you take good care of him." He nodded toward Silverhawk. Eli's gaze flicked between them. "Are you leaving again?" Ryan's throat worked before he answered. "Not if you want me to stay." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Eli gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Silverhawk shifted closer to the rail, pressing his muzzle against Eli's sleeve as if sealing the unspoken agreement. Across the ranch, the feed store's front windows glowed in the early evening. Inside, Ivy sat at her counter, chin propped on her hand, worry lines cutting deeper into her brow. She'd just locked up when the bell over the door chimed again. Gideon Pike stepped in, dust from the day's work still on his jeans. He had that steady, unreadable look about him as he took off his hat. "I hear you're thinking of selling," he said. Ivy sighed. "Thinking of having to. Big chains moving in and I can't match their prices." Gideon leaned on the counter. "What if you didn't have to? I've got money put aside and I don't want to see this place go under. We keep it local, keep folks supplied the way they're used to." For the first time in days, Ivy's shoulders eased. "You'd do that?" He gave a small shrug. "It's worth fighting for." By the time the stars came out over Willow Creek, the air had grown still. In the quiet, the ranch seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that something had shifted, subtle but certain, between father and son, between neighbors, between the past and the shape of the days ahead. The first frost of September lay silver along the fence rails of Willow Creek Ranch, and the mornings carried the crisp bite of the coming cold. Yet inside the ranch house, warmth had begun to seep into places where grief once ruled. Ryan Monroe had returned to Denver only long enough to tie loose ends at the clinic. Within a week, he was back, his bags left in the old guest room, his boots lined beside Caleb's by the door. At first, his presence felt like a ripple in the still pond of Eli's routine. The boy watched him with guarded eyes, unsure if this man with the same gray-blue gaze as his own would stay longer than the snow. Ryan was determined to prove that he would. Mornings were for chores side by side, feeding Silverhawk, fixing a sagging gate, mending fence wire before the frost set in. Ryan learned the quiet language of his son. The way Eli's hands stilled when deep in thought, the half-smile when a joke actually landed, the steady calm that came when Silverhawk's head rested near his shoulder. It was Caleb who suggested the tutoring. "Boy's smart," he said one evening, sitting at the kitchen table with his glasses low on his nose. "Smarter than I was at his age, but he's been through too much disruption, needs someone who can give him consistency." That someone arrived a week later in the form of Claire Donovan, 28, straight-backed, with warm brown eyes and hair the color of sunlit wheat. She'd grown up on a cattle ranch in Montana and carried herself like someone who could handle a stubborn colt or a stubborn child without flinching. She wore sturdy riding boots, a wool skirt, and a smile that made her instantly part of the ranch's rhythm. From the first lesson, Eli leaned forward at the table as Claire explained fractions using pieces of dried apple, her voice low and even. Ryan would linger in the doorway, watching his son's focus tighten, his pencil moving with more confidence. Silverhawk often stood just beyond the porch during lessons, head over the rail as if keeping watch. By late October, the leaves in the foothills had turned to rust and gold. Afternoons were reserved for riding. Sometimes Ryan and Caleb together, sometimes Ryan and Eli, and, increasingly, with Claire riding alongside them. Silverhawk had changed too. Where once he had been wary of strangers, now he allowed Claire to stroke his muzzle, standing patient as Eli brushed his coat. The Mustang's sharp watchfulness had softened, as if he understood that the boy who once clung to him in fear now carried something lighter in his heart. One afternoon, with the air cool and bright, the four of them rode into the foothills. Ryan on his bay gelding, Claire on a dun mare borrowed from the ranch, Eli astride Silverhawk, his small hands steady on the reins. The land opened before them, rolling hills dotted with aspens that shimmered in the wind, the mountains rising beyond like patient sentinels. They paused at a ridge where the grass bent under the breath of autumn. Eli looked around, then down at Silverhawk and said, "It's like Silverhawk knew we all needed to be here." His voice was quiet, but it carried. Ryan felt his throat tighten. Caleb, a few yards behind, heard it too, but said nothing. Claire glanced at Ryan, a faint, knowing smile touching her lips. No one disagreed. For a moment they sat in the stillness, the wind in the grass, the creak of leather, the soft snort from Silverhawk. Ryan reached over and placed his hand on Eli's shoulder. The boy didn't move away. In town, the small general store Ivy ran had become something more than just a place to buy feed and canned goods. The rough winter from the year before had left scars on the community, and some families were still struggling. Remembering how Gideon Pike had stepped in to save her business, Ivy made a decision. She would keep her doors open late on Fridays and offer free feed for anyone who needed it. "It's not charity," she told Gideon when he helped unload sacks of grain from his truck one afternoon. "It's just what's right." Word spread fast. Ranchers from as far as 3 valleys over began showing up, some to accept help, some to offer extra hay or beans in return. The store became a place where news was shared, hands were shaken, and no one left feeling alone. On the Friday before Thanksgiving, Ivy stood behind the counter, her dark hair tucked under a knit cap, watching as 2 boys carried out a sack of oats to their father's truck. She thought about how quickly her life had turned from near ruin to something rooted in purpose. She could trace the thread all the way back to the moment she decided not to walk away, the same stubbornness she saw now in Eli's eyes when he practiced his sums, or in Ryan's shoulders when he worked a fence post into the frozen ground. As the first snow came in November, life at Willow Creek settled into a quiet rhythm. Caleb, though still letting Ryan take the lead with Eli, seemed lighter. He no longer lingered on the porch at dusk like a man waiting for bad news. Claire stayed through the season, her teaching extending beyond numbers and letters. She taught Eli how to read a weather front by the shape of the clouds, how to find the North Star when the sky was clear, how to braid a rope with hands that didn't falter in the cold. One evening, after lessons, Eli stood beside Silverhawk in the barn, brushing the Mustang's thickening winter coat. Ryan leaned on the stall door, watching. "Why do you stay out here so long?" Ryan asked. Eli shrugged. "Silverhawk listens, even when I'm not saying anything." Ryan smiled, a slow, genuine curve of his mouth. "I know the feeling." Outside, snow began to fall, muffling the world. And for the first time in years, the ranch felt less like a place holding its breath, and more like a place where breaths could be taken deeply, without fear of what tomorrow might bring. Winter at Willow Creek was the kind that pressed quietly against the soul. The snow lay deep in the folds of the pasture, a still white sea broken only by the black lines of fence rails and the slow-moving clouds above the mountains. The air had a clarity to it, sharp enough to sting the lungs, but it carried the faint smell of cedar smoke drifting from the ranch house chimney. Beneath the broad branches of the cottonwood tree on the south ridge, a lone figure stood. Eli Monroe, now 15, tall but still wiry, his cheeks flushed from the cold. Silverhawk lay in the snow's gentle hollow, his chestnut coat dulled with age, the black mane streaked with threads of white. Frost clung to the whiskers at his muzzle. His breath came slow and shallow, the rise and fall of his ribs a rhythm Eli had known all his life. The Mustang's eyes, once sharp and blazing, now softened into something almost human, the quiet look of one who knows the journey is ending. Eli knelt beside him, gloved hands brushing gently over the familiar curve of his neck. "Hey, old boy," he whispered, the words trembling. "You remember that fence, the day we met?" His voice caught, and he laughed softly, the sound half broken. "I was just a kid, and I guess I still am. You brought all of this together, you know. You brought me my family." Silverhawk's ears twitched as if acknowledging the truth. Snowflakes drifted between them, melting as they touched the warmth of Eli's tears. Behind them, Ryan, Claire, Caleb, and Martha stood a respectful distance away, their faces turned toward this quiet farewell. No one spoke. The wind itself seemed to hold its breath. The sun climbed slowly above the ridge, turning the snow to a pale gold. Eli stayed with Silverhawk until the Mustang exhaled one final gentle breath. The stillness that followed felt both unbearable and holy. Eli lowered his head, pressing his forehead to Silverhawk's, letting the moment etch itself into memory. That afternoon, they buried him on the highest part of the ridge, where the cottonwood's bare branches reached into the winter sky. The ground was hard, the shovels biting through frozen soil, but no one complained. Caleb set the wooden marker into place, the name Silverhawk carved deep into the grain. Eli planted a handful of wild sunflower seeds, the kind that would bloom bright against the summer grass. "He'd like that," Eli said, and Caleb's weathered hand settled on his grandson's shoulder. Spring came slow to the valley, creeping in with the scent of thawing earth and the sound of meltwater rushing down from the high country. The pasture turned green again, the fences casting long evening shadows. It was in one of those soft evenings that Eli brought his idea to the table. They were gathered in the ranch kitchen, Ryan stirring a pot of stew, Claire slicing bread, Caleb nursing a cup of coffee. Ivy Ortiz had stopped by, her cheeks pink from the ride in. Eli cleared his throat, leaning forward in his chair. "I want to start something," he said. "Something for the kids around here. Some of them have never even touched a horse. I think Silverhawk would want me to change that." Ryan set down the ladle. "What are you thinking, son?" "Free riding lessons," Eli said. "For anyone who wants to learn. We could call it the Silverhawk Project. Teach them about the land, about caring for animals. Give them the kind of place I had." Claire's smile was soft but proud. "It's a good name." Ivy's eyes lit up. "And I'll back it. The store's doing better than ever. We can sponsor the feed, equipment, whatever you need." The decision came easily after that. They talked through the details, fencing in an extra paddock, setting up a small tack room, scheduling weekend lessons. By the time the coffee pot was empty, the project had shape and a start date. The first day of the Silverhawk Project dawned with a sky the color of new denim, the grass still damp with morning dew. Horses stood saddled along the rail, their breath curling into the air. Children began arriving, some with parents, some alone, their eyes wide and curious. Ryan and Claire greeted them, Caleb adjusting stirrups, Ivy handing out apples from a basket. Eli spotted him, a boy standing by the fence, maybe 8 or 9 years old, dark hair falling into his eyes, hands buried deep in the pockets of a too-big jacket. He kept glancing at the horses, then at the ground, unsure. Eli walked over, his boots whispering through the grass. "Hey," he said gently. "First time around horses?" The boy nodded, barely lifting his gaze. "Come on," Eli said, a smile tugging at his mouth. "Let me introduce you to someone." He led the boy to a gentle bay mare, resting a hand on her neck. The boy's fingers hovered, then touched the warm coat, his eyes widening with wonder. Eli remembered another boy at a fence, years ago, staring at a chestnut Mustang who would change everything. Somewhere above the hills, the wind shifted, carrying the faint rustle of cottonwood leaves. And for just a moment, Eli could almost hear Silverhawk's low, steady breath in that sound, a reminder that legacies are not measured in years, but in the lives they shape. In the quiet turning of the seasons, we are reminded that every act of kindness carries the seed of a miracle. Just as the Lord placed Silverhawk in Eli's path, He places people, moments, and opportunities in ours to heal what is broken. Sometimes the greatest blessings come not in the way we expect, but in the way we need. In our daily lives, may we see His hand at work in the small mercies and the quiet answers to prayer. If this story touched your heart, please share it, leave a comment, and subscribe so more souls can be encouraged. May God bless each of you and guide your path. If you believe in His miracles, comment Amen.